A perfect alibi that fooled investigators for decades. In criminal investigations, few things carry more weight than an alibi. It can halt an inquiry, redirect resources, and remove someone from suspicion entirely. Investigators rely on alibis because time is fragile. Witnesses forget. Evidence decays. Momentum matters. When an alibi appears solid, it offers something every investigation craves: certainty. But certainty can be dangerous. Because sometimes, an alibi doesn't just protect the innocent. Sometimes, it protects the guilty so effectively that truth is buried beneath layers of routine, assumption, and human trust. When that happens, the case doesn't simply go cold. It freezes. This is the story of one such case, a case where a perfect alibi didn't collapse under pressure, didn't unravel with time, and didn't crack when challenged. It endured for decades, quietly shielding a crime that should have been solved long ago. Not because it was elaborate, but because it was believable. The crime itself was immediately alarming. The victim vanished under circumstances that made accident or coincidence unlikely. There were no signs of a voluntary disappearance. Personal belongings were left behind. Plans went unfinished. Loved ones felt the absence instantly, and the unease spread fast. People noticed almost immediately that something was deeply wrong. Law enforcement responded with urgency. Interviews began within hours. Friends, family members, coworkers, and acquaintances were questioned one by one. Investigators followed standard procedure, tracing the victim's final movements, identifying those closest to her, and examining possible motives. Tips poured in, timelines were rebuilt, and alibis were tested. And as the picture slowly formed, one name surfaced almost immediately, and it refused to disappear. Someone whose proximity to the victim made them impossible to ignore. Someone who, statistically, should have been scrutinized thoroughly. And briefly, they were. That scrutiny ended the moment the alibi was presented. The suspect explained exactly where they had been during the critical time frame. Their account was calm, consistent, and supported by multiple witnesses. They were seen at a familiar location, engaged in routine activities, surrounded by people who recognized them. The timeline appeared continuous. There was no obvious gap where a crime could occur unnoticed. Investigators checked names, confirmed statements, and found no immediate contradictions. The suspect didn't resist questioning. They didn't appear defensive. They didn't demand a lawyer. They answered everything directly. They appeared cooperative. They appeared credible. They appeared innocent. Investigators documented the alibi thoroughly. Reports described it as reliable and corroborated. Supervisors reviewed the findings and agreed. In a system built on prioritization, the case moved forward without the suspect. The decision felt responsible, logical, final. As the investigation progressed, attention shifted elsewhere. Detectives explored distant possibilities, unlikely suspects, and complex theories. Each lead required time, resources, and justification. As weeks passed, those leads went nowhere. Meanwhile, the suspect continued life uninterrupted. Their name remained in the file, but only as a reference point. A resolved question. A closed door. Months became years. What once felt urgent slowly faded into background noise. The case lost momentum as newer crimes demanded attention. Detectives rotated assignments, and fresh eyes were replaced by thin files and fading memories. Witnesses moved, changed numbers, or passed away. Physical evidence aged poorly, sealed in boxes and pushed into storage rooms few would ever reopen. The alibi, however, remained untouched. It sat at the center of the case, accepted without challenge. No one revisited it. No one pressed harder. It became part of the case's foundation. Solid, assumed, and unquestioned. And because of that, the truth stayed buried far longer than it should have. Decades later, the case resurfaced. Cold case units exist for one reason: to challenge conclusions that time once forced investigators to accept. Advances in forensic science, digital analysis, and behavioral psychology had reopened doors long thought sealed. New detectives approached the file with no emotional attachment and no personal history. They read everything from the beginning, line by line, And there it was, the alibi, still intact. At first, they treated it the same way earlier investigators had. They accepted it as fact and moved on. But one detective hesitated. Something about the speed with which the suspect had been cleared didn't sit right. Not because the alibi was weak, but because it had never been stressed. The team began examining witness statements again, this time focusing less on what was said and more on how it was remembered. When witnesses were re-interviewed, something unexpected happened. Certainty dissolved. Witnesses who once sounded confident now struggled to explain how they knew what time it was. Many admitted they hadn't checked a clock. They estimated. They assumed. They relied on routine. They remembered seeing the suspect because they expected to see them, not because they noticed anything unusual. This realization forced investigators to confront a difficult truth about memory. Human memory does not function like a camera. It is shaped by expectation, repetition, and context. When nothing feels out of place, details are rarely preserved. The suspect was a familiar presence in a familiar environment. That familiarity erased scrutiny. The alibi relied almost entirely on routine behavior. The suspect had a predictable schedule and a pattern of appearing in the same place at the same time. Witnesses recalled the pattern, not the day. When investigators reconstructed the timeline minute by minute, subtle inconsistencies emerged. No single contradiction stood out. But several moments lacked confirmation. There were short periods where no one could say exactly where the suspect was. Those moments had been filled in by assumption. Investigators also noticed how early the suspect had shaped the narrative. They didn't wait for detectives to ask where they were. They volunteered the information. They provided names. They offered explanations that felt helpful rather than defensive. At the time, this behavior had been praised. In retrospect, it looked strategic. Psychological consultants explained that early narratives become anchors. Once investigators accept a timeline, their brains subconsciously protect it. Conflicting evidence feels disruptive and is often minimized. Supporting details feel comforting and are emphasized. The alibi became the lens through which all evidence was viewed. As the cold case team pressed further, witnesses were confronted gently with their own uncertainty. Many were disturbed by how much they had assumed rather than observed. Some expressed guilt. Others expressed shock. None had intentionally misled investigators. They had simply trusted their own memories. When the suspect was approached again decades later, the difference was subtle, but noticeable. They remained calm, but their precision had faded. Details once delivered effortlessly now required thought. Clarifications were requested. Corrections followed. Time had weakened the performance. Forensic evidence that had once been dismissed as inconclusive was re-examined using modern methods. While still not definitive, it no longer supported the alibi as clearly as once believed. The certainty investigators once relied on was gone. What ultimately dismantled the alibi was not a confession, a witness recantation, or a dramatic revelation. It was accumulation. Small uncertainties replacing one massive assumption. The realization that the alibi had never been independently verified. It had been accepted. And acceptance had cost decades. When investigators finally reconstructed the events without relying on the original timeline, the truth became visible. The suspect had committed the crime, and then returned to their routine as if nothing had happened. They relied on predictability, on familiarity, on the idea that normal behavior could never conceal something monstrous. The case profoundly affected those involved in reopening it. Detectives admitted that it changed how they viewed alibis forever. No longer as shields, but as claims that must be tested relentlessly. Because the most dangerous alibi is not one that sounds rehearsed. It is one that sounds ordinary. Today, the case stands as a warning taught quietly among investigators. It reminds them that certainty can be seductive, that trust can blind, and that normality can be the most effective disguise of all. The alibi didn't fool investigators because they were careless. It fooled them because they were human. And that is what makes it terrifying. Because somewhere, right now, another perfect alibi may still be working. Quiet. Convincing. Undisturbed. Waiting.